pushing Americans to transition to electrical vehicles. And while they claim cars can drive clean,
America's EV dream didn't fade, it collapsed. And now Ford, Chevy, and GM are staring down a deadline they might not survive. The companies that built the backbone of American driving poured billions into an electric future, but instead of leading the charge, they're watching their plans fall apart piece by piece. Failed launches, frozen factories, EVs piling up on lots. And insiders say 2026 isn't a turning point, it's the breaking point. This is reality catching up. Detroit's biggest names are running out of time, out of cash, and out of second chances. And the fallout is about to hit every driver in the country. So what triggered this collapse? Who let it get this bad? And what happens to America when the big three can't keep up? Overinvestment in unrealistic EV production targets. Ford, Chevy, and GM walked into the electric era like they were invincible. They promised America they would dominate electric mobility, outmatch every newcomer, and prove that Detroit still controlled the future.
People do believe in EVs, and there's a huge opportunity there. So at General Motors, we're just focused on executing well. We've, really worked to listen and understand what the customer's looking for.
But behind closed doors, executives committed to electric production targets so unrealistic, they now read like fiction. They announced timelines that sounded bold on stage, yet were impossible inside their own plants. They locked themselves to huge electric expansion plans without possessing the capacity, pacing discipline, or technological readiness to fulfill them. Instead of easing into the transition, they dumped billions into aggressive electric build-outs that demanded flawless execution. But Detroit has never been a city of perfection. It is a city of endurance. And endurance collapses under deadlines that ignore reality. Their electric factories fell behind schedule. Their internal projections spiraled. Every missed checkpoint forced them to spend more, promise more, and dig deeper into a commitment they could no longer control. Capital vanished. Flexibility disappeared. These companies chained themselves to targets designed to impress headlines rather than reflect operational truth. And as the calendar crept toward 2026, these promises transformed from ambition into liability. Detroit's giants were no longer steering the future. They were being crushed by the expectations they had built themselves. And the next failure came from a place they never thought would betray them: misreading mainstream consumer psychology. Ford, Chevy, and GM believed America would follow them into the electric age simply because they declared the future had arrived. They were wrong. Early electric adopters created a powerful illusion, one that convinced executives the entire country shared the same excitement, curiosity, and identity tied to electric vehicles. Detroit assumed the electric spark would jump effortlessly across the entire nation. It didn't. Instead of understanding the real American mindset, they built strategies around a fantasy version of the average driver. They ignored regional identity, cultural nuance, and the emotional weight of automotive tradition. They convinced themselves that Americans wanted a clean break from the familiar, even though countless communities still connected deeply with trucks, muscle, and mechanical familiarity. Detroit spoke to a crowd that didn't exist, crafting electric messaging designed for admiration rather than authenticity. And the disconnect widened with every announcement. As months passed, it became painfully clear that the average American did not feel the same way the boardrooms expected. These companies shaped their electric lineups around imagined desires, creating vehicles meant for a psychological profile that lived only in marketing slides. The result: a massive gulf between corporate vision and national sentiment. And this gulf pushed Detroit toward a new crisis, one buried deep, not in public perception, but within their own engineering corridors. Before we continue, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments so this story reaches more people. R&D fragmentation and platform chaos. While the public narrative praised innovation, the internal reality at Ford, Chevy, and GM was chaos masked as progress. Their research divisions scrambled to reinvent themselves overnight, launching electric platforms without unified direction. Each division pushed its own revolutionary idea. Each engineering group believed it held the future. The result was not innovation, it was fragmentation. Instead of one strong electric strategy, Detroit built half a dozen competing visions. Engineers raced to develop prototypes that shared almost nothing with one another. Software teams wrote code for platforms that would never merge. Hardware divisions created components that overlapped in purpose but clashed in execution. Every department pulled the companies in conflicting directions. None of the paths joined. All of the budgets inflated. This internal disunity shattered momentum. Instead of steady technological advancement, Detroit suffered bottlenecks, duplicated work, and prolonged rollout cycles. Their electric dreams splintered into incompatible pieces that could never form a cohesive whole. High-level executives kept pushing for faster results, but fragmentation cannot be rushed into harmony. It can only implode. And Detroit discovered that their engineering chaos carried a visible, unavoidable price one that hit hardest where the physical vehicles were supposed to come to life: factory-level EV production inefficiency. When it came time to build the electric vehicles they had promised, Ford, Chevy, and GM confronted the harshest truth of all. Their factories simply could not do it. The electric platforms they envisioned required a completely different choreography, new pacing, new spatial layouts, and new manufacturing rhythms that their legacy plants were never designed to support. They tried to force electric production into old systems, and the old systems fought back. Assembly lines slowed to a crawl. Teams struggled to adapt to unfamiliar sequencing. Processes built for decades of traditional engineering clashed with the demands of electric construction. Rather than refine their workflow before scaling, Detroit accelerated before understanding. The result was inefficiency at every level. Per-vehicle assembly costs rose. Margins thinned. Every electric project became a financial drag instead of a breakthrough. The factories that once symbolized American manufacturing power turned into reminders of how far Detroit had fallen behind the future it claimed to lead. And with 2026 approaching, Ford, Chevy, and GM faced the nightmare they had created, an electric vision collapsing under the weight of its own promises. And this collapse opened the door to the forces that would strike from outside, pressures far too big for Detroit to survive: battery commodity volatility. The true shock to the electric transition did not begin inside any automaker's walls. It began in the mines, markets, and trading floors that fed the global battery supply. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite materials, once considered stable pillars of the energy shift, became symbols of volatility almost overnight. Entire production plans depended on these elements, yet their markets behaved like unpredictable tides. Prices would surge within weeks, fall unexpectedly, then spike again with little warning. It was not just instability. It was chaos cloaked in geological limitation and global speculation. Raw material traders understood the stakes. Every slight shift in international mining output triggered sweeping reactions across commodity exchanges. Countries with expanding extraction capabilities tightened export policies, while others raised strategic reserves. The world had tied its future to substances produced in limited regions, creating vulnerability that reverberated across every electric project on the planet. Automakers trying to plan multi-year strategies found themselves resetting cost structures repeatedly. Each recalibration altered forecasts, payment schedules, supplier contracts, and projected margins. The unpredictability flowed through every spreadsheet, every planning call, every long-term projection. A battery's value might look reasonable one quarter and unbearable the next, making it impossible to chart a stable progression from prototype to scaled unit. And as this volatility continued, the stress radiated outward, shaping the next external pressure in line: interest rate aftershock on auto financing. The second force arrived from an entirely different direction, carried not by minerals or supply, but by monetary policy. When central banks raised interest rates to control inflation, the effect on vehicle financing was swift and ruthless. For decades, long-term auto loans had been anchored by relatively low borrowing costs, allowing customers to stretch repayment schedules without unbearable financial weight. That era ended abruptly. High interest rates transformed financing into an expensive commitment, reshaping how buyers approached the idea of acquiring new vehicles. Financing offices across the country faced a steady shift in borrower expectations. Monthly loan structures that once seemed manageable now appeared heavy, and repayment schedules that previously offered flexibility turned into burdensome obligations. Since long-term car loans rely on predictable interest conditions, every percentage point increase created a fresh wave of caution. The cost of borrowing rose again and again, leaving fewer people willing to take on multi-year commitments. The result was a broad cooling of the new vehicle market that touched every brand equally. This was not a matter of preference or attitude. It was pure mathematics applied to household budgets. When people calculated the total repayment of a loan at elevated interest levels, hesitation followed naturally. Even those who still intended to upgrade their vehicles stretched their ownership cycles instead, extending the time between purchases. And as the lending climate hardened, it opened the door to yet another external disruption waiting on the political horizon. Political instability of EV incentives, the third force, struck from the realm of policy, where decisions shifted as rapidly as the national mood. Electric vehicles depended on a patchwork of tax credits, subsidies, and regulatory targets intended to encourage a long-term transition. Yet these mechanisms were vulnerable to political tides, and every change in leadership brought a new interpretation of what the country's energy priorities should be. What began as a supportive framework turned into an unpredictable landscape that made multi-year planning nearly impossible. Legislators debated electric targets with fervor. Some administrations emphasized aggressive adoption timelines, while others scaled them back or postponed them entirely. Tax credits that once seemed reliable faced revision, reduction, or elimination. State-level authorities layered their own rules on top of national directives, creating regions with sharply divergent policies. Each fluctuation altered the larger strategic environment, leaving companies without a consistent foundation on which to build out electric plans extending 5 or 10 years into the future. Investors watched these shifts carefully. When incentives appeared strong, long-term projects looked aligned with policy. When incentives wavered, faith in projected returns weakened. This inconsistency reshaped supply agreements, capital schedules, and partnership strategies across the entire sector. The electric transition was not simply a technological challenge, it became a political one. And as the policy landscape continued to swing, a fourth external force emerged from an unexpected corner of American life: regional electricity cost inequality. The fourth force was rooted not in policy or finance, but in geography itself. Electricity pricing in the United States varied dramatically from one state to another, creating a hidden layer of inequality that shaped the appeal of electric vehicles across the map. A resident of one state might enjoy relatively low kilowatt-hour rates, making the energy required to operate an electric car feel manageable. Yet in another region, particularly areas with isolated grids or heavy reliance on imported energy, electricity costs soared high enough to make the same idea far less attractive. This disparity carried deep consequences: energy monopolies, regional generation limitations, and differences in grid composition produced a pricing environment where location determined practicality. Households in states with elevated electricity rates faced heavier operational burdens, regardless of how advanced the electric models became. Even when new power solutions rolled out, the legacy structure of regional energy markets kept the gulf wide. For some communities, the reality of living with higher energy costs created a natural deterrent to electric adoption. These regional divides were not temporary. They were anchored in historical infrastructure decisions, resource availability, and long-term regulatory choices. As the country attempted to move toward a more unified vision of the electric future, these embedded differences worked quietly in the background, shaping perceptions in ways that no corporation or political figure could fully control. And as these geographical forces persisted, they paved the way for even larger pressures waiting in the competitive arena beyond: China's ultra-low-cost EV manufacturing dominance. The turning point in the electric vehicle war did not come from Detroit. It came from across the ocean, where Chinese automakers rewrote the rulebook on electric manufacturing. Their rise was not accidental. They built systems capable of producing electric vehicles at costs that legacy American companies simply could not match. Their factories integrated vertically, streamlined platform designs, and perfected processes that delivered speed, scale, and affordability with unmatched precision. This combination created a global imbalance overnight, placing United States brands at a distinct disadvantage. Chinese manufacturers pioneered simplified electric platforms that reduced production complexity while accelerating turnaround times. They aligned software, chassis, and battery architecture into cohesive systems instead of juggling incompatible components. Their battery manufacturing techniques matured rapidly, allowing them to generate massive output with lower operational burden. As these methods advanced, their per-unit cost fell faster than projections, giving them a structural lead. The final vehicles, often minimalist but functional, fit neatly into consumer expectations across numerous international markets. The effect was immediate and profound. United States. Automakers found themselves unable to compete on the global stage. Even markets historically friendly to American brands shifted toward Chinese options that delivered value without compromising basic capability. The global automotive hierarchy began to tilt as these foreign companies established dominance not through style or heritage, but through relentless cost efficiency. And as this global shift unfolded, another front in the competitive battle emerged closer to home. If you have been watching this far, make sure you subscribe right now. The next episodes uncover even deeper shifts inside the industry, and missing them means missing the truth behind what happens after this collapse spreads nationwide. Startups redefining value and breaking legacy pricing logic. While foreign giants reshaped the global landscape, a different disruption unfolded inside the United States. A wave of electric startups emerged with business models that bore no resemblance to legacy practices. These companies operated with lean teams, uncluttered structures, and bold product philosophies. Instead of inheriting decades of organizational weight, they built themselves from the ground up with one objective: delivering electric vehicles that redefined value. Their agility became their greatest weapon. Startups avoided the legacy costs that encumbered older automakers. Without sprawling administrative layers or dated operational traditions, they developed electric models that emphasized simplicity, efficiency, and clear purpose. Their vehicles were engineered to meet specific needs rather than to fit into existing product hierarchies. This allowed them to strip away unnecessary complexity and focus on practical features. The result was a new kind of offering that reshaped how consumers evaluated electric purchases. People began to see that these newcomers offered solutions grounded in clarity rather than tradition. Legacy pricing logic collapsed under this pressure. Traditional automakers built their valuations around institutional history, extensive catalog breadth, and decades of brand development. The newcomers ignored those conventions and let product strength speak for itself. This created a pricing environment that no longer rewarded past prestige. Instead, the market began to judge electric vehicles through a clearer lens of function, innovation, and transparency. And as this value shift gathered momentum, yet another competitive disadvantage surfaced in the world of infrastructure: charging network disadvantage. The next blow came not from manufacturing efficiency or value disruption, but from infrastructure capability. Rivals, both domestic and international, built charging ecosystems that far outpaced anything offered by the legacy American brands. Their networks were denser, faster, more reliable, and integrated with intuitive software that made the charging experience straightforward. Drivers gravitated toward vehicles backed by strong charging ecosystems because they offered reassurance, convenience, and consistency. These networks did more than fuel electric vehicles. They created a sense of technological cohesion. Drivers learned quickly that a well-built charging environment transformed daily use into something seamless. Competitors understood this early and invested aggressively in building stations that communicated smoothly with their vehicles, updated real-time availability, and offered predictable performance. This harmony between car and charger cultivated confidence, making drivers feel as though they were stepping into an interconnected system rather than a fragmented experience. Legacy brands attempted to align with these advanced ecosystems, but the disparity remained visible. Their vehicles lacked the same level of integration and operated within patchier networks that made long-distance travel or frequent charging feel uncertain. When drivers compared experiences, they often discovered that the competitors' systems simply worked better. perception turned into reputation, and reputation hardened into expectation. And just as this infrastructure disadvantage settled into public consciousness, another challenge emerged from within the technological reliability of the vehicles themselves. EV recall waves, damaging brand trust. The final competitive blow arose from a string of high-profile recalls that eroded confidence in American electric reliability. Each incident created a new wave of scrutiny, a software irregularity here, a component malfunction there, a mechanical fault requiring immediate corrective action. All of it added weight to the perception that domestic electric vehicles carried risks that their rivals avoided. While recalls are a natural part of manufacturing, the visibility of these issues amplified their impact. When major models faced recalls, the stories traveled quickly. Drivers questioned whether the vehicles they depended on were engineered with sufficient precision. Issues ranging from unintended acceleration caused by hardware slips to calibration inconsistencies in electric platforms stirred doubts within the broader public. These were not concerns rooted in technology aversion, but in product dependability. Every recall reinforced the belief that something fundamental had been overlooked in development. Competitors, however, maintained steadier reputations during this period. Their vehicles benefited from narratives of stability, creating a contrast that positioned them as more reliable options. As these narratives deepened, trust migrated away from legacy American electric efforts. This shift carried long-term consequences. Trust, once lost, does not return easily. And as trust continued to erode, it set off a chain reaction that would ripple across the entire country. Labor shock and the rise of a disillusioned workforce. The collapse of electric ambitions landed hardest on the people who built the American automotive story. When the transition toward electric vehicles accelerated, factories that had once roared with activity began to quiet. Electric platforms required fewer hands, fewer specialized roles, and fewer long-term staff positions. Entire teams that had worked for decades on traditional systems discovered that their roles no longer fit the new landscape. Layoffs spread through towns where automotive jobs were the backbone of local identity, leaving workers with a sense of abandonment and confusion. Communities dependent on these plants felt the impact immediately. Small businesses near the factories saw foot traffic decline. Cafes, hardware stores, and local services that once thrived on steady worker demand faced sharp downturns. Families who had relied on stable incomes confronted sudden uncertainty. The shift struck not only through lost wages, but also through a loss of purpose. Generations of workers who had built their livelihoods around automotive craftsmanship felt displaced from the very industry they helped define. In some regions, bitterness replaced optimism. People who once believed in the electric transition began to view it as a force that uprooted communities instead of offering renewal. Conversations shifted from excitement to apprehension. The workforce became divided between those who still hoped for reinvention and those who believed the industry had left them behind. That growing tension became fertile ground for a larger cultural conflict waiting just beyond the factory gates. EVs becoming a political battlefield. What began as a technological shift soon evolved into a symbol of ideological belonging. Electric vehicles entered the national conversation not merely as products, but as political statements. Parties and public figures used them as markers of allegiance, transforming a mode of transportation into a cultural litmus test. This partisan framing magnified existing frustrations and created an atmosphere where personal identity became intertwined with the cars people chose to drive. In some regions, electric vehicles represented progress, environmental responsibility, and modernity. In others, they symbolized elitism, moral pressure, or perceived cultural imposition. Media outlets leaned into these contrasts, amplifying narratives that framed electric adoption as a gesture aligned with one side of the political spectrum. Even everyday discussions among friends or co-workers took on tones shaped by broader cultural divisions. The cars themselves no longer stood at the center of the debate. Instead, the values projected onto them did. This polarization fractured the national market. People who might once have considered an electric model began to view it through the lens of identity rather than practicality. Groups who felt alienated by the political messaging distanced themselves further from the idea, deepening the divide. As these cultural trenches hardened, the nation's position on the global stage began to shift as well, revealing a new set of challenges that extended far beyond personal preference. America losing global auto leadership. As domestic divisions intensified, the world watched the United States struggle to maintain its historic leadership in the automotive sector. For decades, American automakers had shaped global trends, defining standards of innovation and engineering excellence. But as electric ambitions faltered and competitors advanced their own agendas, the international balance tilted. Nations that once looked to American brands as industry benchmarks shifted their attention toward emerging leaders. This shift carried heavy geopolitical consequences. The global electric narrative increasingly aligned with countries that demonstrated momentum and unity in their strategies. Their manufacturers introduced electric models that captured global interest, supported by cohesive national visions for mobility. International markets gravitated toward these rising powers, drawn by their clarity of direction and their ability to present a unified industrial front. American influence, once unquestioned, began to wane. Manufacturing partnerships, trade deals, and technology exchanges reflected this changing landscape. Countries seeking reliable long-term partners looked beyond the United States, pursuing alliances with competitors that appeared more stable in their electric strategies. The erosion of leadership was not simply commercial, it reshaped the country's strategic standing in the broader technological race. And as the global spotlight moved elsewhere, another domestic reaction gathered momentum within American households: consumer backlash and the return to gas vehicles. The final wave of fallout came from the public itself. After years of conflicting messages, shifting narratives, and disappointment tied to unmet expectations, consumers began to retreat from the electric experiment. Many drivers gravitated back toward traditional gas vehicles, seeing them as symbols of stability amid uncertainty. Familiarity offered comfort. The sound of an engine, the predictability of maintenance routines, and the unchanging experience of fueling became reassuring constants in a world filled with shifting technological promises. Households that once explored electric options returned to models they understood intuitively. For some, it was a matter of habit. For others, it was a return to something that felt dependable after a period marked by rapid change and cultural tension. Dealerships noticed the resurgence of interest in traditional models, and service centers experienced renewed activity as drivers recommitted to familiar routines. It was not a rejection of technology altogether, but rather a retreat to what felt stable during a time of transition. This behavioral shift slowed the momentum of the electric movement more than any technical setback could. When consumers reaffirmed their attachment to older systems, the national electric vision lost the grassroots support it needed to thrive. The dream of a unified electric transition dimmed as the country pivoted back toward legacy habits. And that's the reality. America's EV dream has cracked, and the big three are racing toward a brutal 2026. But I want to hear from you. Can Ford, Chevy, and GM survive this? Or is the collapse already in motion? Drop your thoughts below. I'm reading every comment. If this opened your eyes, hit like, share the video, and subscribe for the next chapter. This story is far from over.